Hello and welcome to the Barrcast. I'm your host, Nick Barr, coming to you on a brisk Monday morning here in New York. We're in November, which means Halloween is behind us. And we've reached the crest of the Enneagram, the 12 o'clock of the Enneagram, the top of the Enneagram. We've reached type 9. So remember, we started at 4, so we still have 1, 2, 3 to go. And why is 9 at the top? I talk about that a little bit in another piece where I describe the core triangle. And so we're at the center of the doing triad. That's one way to talk about why we're at the top. But the other way is that the 9 is sort of, it's interesting. So there's two kind of inputs I want to share, and then we'll read Naranjo's introduction to the 9. One is Richard Rohr, who makes the point, and Rohr has traveled the world teaching the Enneagram. I don't think there's much reason to doubt him here, that he sees when he goes to the least developed countries, he sees the 9 becomes very prevalent. And what he takes from that is the 9 is sort of more of, it's a less neurotic state. So I think the more advanced, scare quotes are on advanced, the more civilized, scare quotes are on civilized, the more developed a society is, the more you'll see other types, other forms of neuroses. The 9 is sort of like the baseline personality type. It's the least egoic. So one thing you could say is that the 9 has the least work to do. If we're going to say maybe the 4 or potentially the 5, but usually people would point to the 4 as having the most work to do, but also being the most excited or enthusiastic or capable of doing the work. The 9 has the least work to do, but probably is the least likely, you might say. I mean, the 7, the 8, 7, 8, 9, I think that region is probably the least likely, but for different reasons. The 9, one could potentially say is like has less to do, but is less likely to do it. And we'll talk about why, but it comes down to essentially ignorance or laziness or blindness or being asleep. It's sort of like the even before the original sin, it's the original sin. So what do I mean by that? In Western tradition with Adam and Eve, we have the sin of knowledge, right? Of eating from the tree of knowledge. But in other traditions, more the Greek tradition with the river of Lethos, or some Eastern traditions, the original sin is a little bit more basic. It's the sin of sort of forgetting. And the 9 is a forgetter. The 9 is a self-forgetter. There's a sleepiness to the 9. And that's a very difficult thing to overcome. So they're kind of like right at the root of spiritual awakening, which is their work is to overcome their spiritual and potentially sort of psychological sleepiness. So their passion is sloth or indolence. In Spanish here, it's la pereza. And if you've studied some Spanish, maybe you remember the name for the sloth, the animal, is oso perezoso, which is lazy bear. So la pereza is lazy, but also evokes sloth in the same way that sloth literally invites in sloth. So one thing I wanted to sort of say was this ignorance piece. One way of looking at the 12 o'clock position of the 9, you know what I mean, right? At the top of the circle. One way to look at that is that they're sort of they dwell at the home base of ignorance. They're right at the root cause of all of this suffering, all of this confusion, all of this reactivity, all of this patterning. So they both have less of a complicated ego structure, but their ego structure, they're really locked into this laziness or this a sleep quality. Whereas, you know, when we say the 4 has the most work to do, but it's the most likely to do it, the 4 really suffers. So the 4 is highly motivated to go on a spiritual quest to figure out why does it feel so bad to be me? How do I address this brokenness or this felt sense of emptiness? That's kind of that's baked into the 4's ego structure. The 9 is like, not that bad. Things are pretty good. So you can see why the 9 might have less motivation. The last thing I just want to say about the 9's position in the Enneagram is the other reason people sometimes put the 9 at the top is precisely because of the 9's own self-forgetting. They are uniquely naturally skilled at seeing the points of view of all the other types. And this is something that happens with the 9 oftentimes. If you're working with a 9 on the Enneagram and helping them find their number, they could see themselves. Yeah, I could see that. I could see that. I could see that. So they might walk away. If you give them a tour of the numbers, they might walk away feeling like they could possibly be 4 or 5 different numbers. And again, going back a little bit just to structure. So 9, 6, 3, these are the core numbers. They form this core triangle. And those are the stretch and release points for each. And I've found with my own work with 9s, 6s, and 3s is that there's a lot of movement between those numbers. And so a 6 and a 9 are both likely to not really know what their number is afterwards, after an orientation. And the 6 will take the more skeptical side of it. I don't think that's me. I don't think that's me. I'm not sure. Can you just tell me what I am, etc. And the 9 would take more of kind of a open, credible, credulous. Yeah, that could be me. That could be me. So they're similar, but they're fundamentally different. And as we get into the 9, we'll further disambiguate it from the 6 and the 3. And then I guess there is one more thing. When the 9 is such an interesting number, the last thing I want to mention is the 9 sits between these two high energy numbers, 8 and 1, and yet is the lowest energy number in the Enneagram. So we've already covered the 8, who we've talked about as highly energized and amoral type. And then the 1 is a hypermoral type. And the 9 is like morally conflicted or in a sort of spiral with respect to morality. So you've just got these really strong types on either wing of the 9, and the 9 is totally different. So I'm sure we'll touch on that too. But this is not, if you're just joining us for some reason, this is not an introduction to the Enneagram. We're actually just covering the subtypes, and Naranjo's the text here. Naranjo just gives just the briefest of introductions to the overall type before going to the subtypes. So let's hear from the man himself on Enneatype 9, Sloth. Sloth here refers to a sloth of consciousness. Having a passion for sloth means having the motivation to maintain a low level of awareness so that no stimuli, whether emotional or environmental, can conflict with the pre-existing status quo or equilibrium. Faced with a loss of life's meaning, the 9 responds with spiritual and psychological indolence, a, quote, deafness to the spirit, and a loss of the sense of being to the point of not even knowing the difference, a spiritual coarsening. Energy is invested in external action, which compulsively seeks to resolve any type of conflict or confusion without cognitive processing or connection to inner needs and their emotional significance. All conflict is nullified through a loss of interiority. So we're talking about kind of action that maintains homeostasis. That's the action of the 9. That's the energy of the 9. He continues, the 9 is a generally person who, even from childhood, was forced to practice a kind of numbness to avoid confronting the wound of being unacknowledged as a child. This is a child who has deeply renounced their nature and self-connection, seeking to fill their existential void by merging with others and serving others' needs. The relentless activity hides a profound sense of inadequacy and lack of importance to anyone. They reacted to the lack of care and recognition by identifying with the maternal function, aiming to take care of the mother and often the entire family, and thus, only by caring for others could they care for themselves and find a place in the world. So I'll pause there. And again, this is sort of some of the paradox of the nine is sometimes you'll read about the nine and they'll be sort of the healthiest of the Enneagram numbers, the healthiest, maybe the least problematic childhood, very well-rounded, not neurotic, kind of a healthy functioning member of society with really healthy pro-social attitudes. And through another lens, you'll sometimes hear about the nine and sort of, as I think Naranjo does here, it sort of sounds like the most brutal kind of childhood, unacknowledged, ignored, basically can't be an individual, can't have interiority. And it's sort of like, I think the answer is both and, depending on whether you're taking a psychological or a spiritual lens. From the psychological lens, i.e. like the healing lens or the excavation lens, I don't know. I mean, I don't know enough about nines and therapy, but I don't know if the nines have the wounding of the nine. My belief is the nines are less wounded psychologically. But from a spiritual perspective, it's like, I think that the nine maybe is the one who needs to be shaken the most. The nine really has to reckon with what Naranjo is trying to have them reckon with here, the lack of care, the lack of recognition, the lack of acknowledgement, the lack of interiority, the lack of their place in the world, the presence of an existential void. There's a real feeling for me, for Naranjo, that he's trying to wake the nine up. And so the nine maybe has to be sort of shaken the most to wake up. But that's not quite the same as the depth of wounding that a nine has. So it's, I don't know, it's ambiguous here. Let's continue. Faced with the pain of separation, the nine denies separation itself, as they lack awareness and, above all, do not differentiate between the feeling of an I and the awareness of a you. If there's no separation between you and me, then illusorily, there's also no possibility of being abandoned. I think that's just the heart of the passion right there. Must not have an interiority. I can't have an I. Must keep a lack of boundary. Must keep fusing. Must keep non-separateness, right? So it's very sneaky because it almost sounds spiritually awake. It almost sounds, from a Buddhist perspective, something like non-self. But it's the evil twin of non-self. It's the evil twin of real insight into non-separation. It's more of like the baby. It's the nostalgic wish to stay young, where there's no difference between me and mama. And then I can never be abandoned as long as I'm close to mama, right? That's the kind of, and as Naranjo says, I think the nine simultaneously holds the feeling of the infant staying close to mama, but then also the mama taking care of the infant. In both cases, they preserve the fusion of I and thou, at the great expense of having any kind of I at all. So that's the heart of the passion. In order to maintain this lack of differentiation, the nine demonstrates a considerable aversion to introspection and change, developing a lifestyle aimed at self-forgetting. That's their fixation. Behaviorally, they engage in distractions such as overeating, overworking, or filling time with the accumulating activities, even intellectually or professionally, like reading or spending hours in front of the TV. They perform their activities robotically without complaining about fatigue, displaying a high level of anesthesia, even physically. They neither listen to the needs nor the pains of their body and often neglect their appearance. So that's sort of why this strategy, like all the strategies of all the antitypes, doesn't work. Oh gosh, as long as I stay fused to the other, then there's no I to be disappointed. There's no I to be hurt. There's no I to be abandoned. But self forgetting, I think, somewhat obviously, is not a good strategy. Um, One is the nine might find themselves in a spot where they really do need to make a decision on behalf of themselves and will be very ill-equipped to do so, right? Maybe their partner will leave them, or someone close to them will die. There will be sort of some jolt at which they need to become a self-sufficient I. Or they'll fuse with the wrong person, right? And end up sort of unhappy, and sort of wake up at some point, gosh, I really didn't choose well who my relationships are, what my job is, etc. So the robotic living only works for so long. And again, by also by ignoring themselves, they might end up suffering greatly. They'll ignore the warning signs of physical or emotional distress. So that's the introduction to the nine, and we will continue on with the social nine, whose keyword is participation or belonging.